The Wilds is an inner city national monument. It's in the center of urban Johannesburg in the suburb of Houghton. And it was an overgrown, unused place of crime. I started restoring it 8 years ago. I think at the beginning I was quite overwhelmed. It was just all this greenery and jungle. And it hurt me seeing how the plants weren't being cared for. The branches were collapsing and plants were dying and weeds were taking over. I live in an apartment next to this 40-acre park and had this puppy who needed to go walking every day. And it seemed crazy to me to have to drive to parks which are further away because, well, my neighbors told me the Wilds was far too dangerous to walk in. It's kind of like an Eden, and 40 acres of it is extraordinary. And I was the only one walking there.
Photographer Arthur Dlamini volunteered to help me.
Ngenze ngazinikela ukusebenza la, nganikela isikhathi sami ukusebenza la. Uthando lwemvelo la ukhona khona ukuzicabanga. Ujule engqondweni yakho. Uzindle, just meditate and be still. Nokudaliwe. Iyona nto eyangenza ngazinikela la ngathi, you know what, ngizothatha isikhathi sami ngizinikele ekusebenzeni lana.
It was given to the city in the 1930s by JCI Limited, a mining finance company, and it was laid out from then onwards.
I guess those ridges were a bit too steep to build houses on, so they gave it to the city on condition it was used as a public park. And then in the old days they had horticulturalists working there and quite a big team. It was seen as Joburg's botanical garden, and they would bring plants, succulents, seeds from around the country and plant them. The Wilds is divided into two halves. There's the East and the West Wilds. And the West Wilds is where I started my work, and that's the more park-like side. It's got big lawns and generous flower beds.
Yonke le ndawo yayifana yanje. Angwakangeneki ngaphakathi, ihlahla zivalile yonke indawo. So kwamele sinqamule ezinye ihlahla. Amagatsha ebewaphuma la kwamele siwanqamule ukuze kuzokhona ukwenzakala ipathway.
For me, one of the best surprises was finding the Yellowwood trees. There's two areas of Yellowwood forest. They run down a kind of an old stream that comes off the hillside. And Yellowwood trees take forever to grow. They're really, really slow. And these Yellowwood trees have like trunks like this. So it's almost 100 years worth of planting. And it sits on the ridges, on the Witwatersrand ridges. And those hills have aquifers inside them. So there's this enormous amount of water feeding the trees. And that's why there's such extraordinary forest there. We did a lot of the chopping and clearing and planting, and we fixed quite a lot of the infrastructure, and we made the park nice. But we couldn't get people to go back there. It had this reputation from the old days as being this terrible, scary place. And so I turned to my own art making process. And I'd never made sculptures before, but I thought, what if I took my charcoal drawings and cut them out of metal? So for Mandela Day in 2017, I installed 67 owls. And that became the tipping point for the Wilds. On that day, there were about 300 people there. That was chaos. People were bringing their tools and they were helping to work. And the kids were screaming because they were counting the owls. And people were out doing picnics. And suddenly it changed. And we put the kudu in on the hillside with a view of the Joburg skyline behind. And I did some clip springers. I did the ostriches on top of the hill. But I started to think, I need one really big defining piece that's visible from the road. So I worked on plans for a 5-meter tall, life-size giraffe, painted pink so that it stood out from the landscape. And I positioned that on the large lawn which is adjacent to the road. So as people drive past, they see this head of a pink giraffe and they're like, what is that in between the forest? We discovered through reading archives that when Sir Percy Fitzpatrick was writing Jock of the Bushveld, he lived in a house next to the Wilds and would walk across those ridges every day. I thought, well, let's celebrate Jock of the Bushveld. And so I commissioned an artist, the late Andrew Lindsay, and he did this fabulous mosaic, which is on top of the hill, and it says Jock's View, and it looks out over the forest of the wilds. It's got the city skyline behind.
Into ejabulisayo ngokuba le ndawo thula okula. Njengoba ngiloku ngikhula kuningi engikufundayo ngokubheka imvelo. Indlela imvelo ezikhulisa ngakhona, the seasons, iy'khathi zemvelo, kuney'khathi la yonke into ivele ife, kuney'khathi la yonke into ivele iqhakaze.
We found in the East Wilds this old labyrinth of pathways. They were completely overgrown with weeds.
Kunama-rose quartz, kunama-crystal kule ndawo. Ngihlale ngitshela nabantu uma ufika la hamba ngeenyawo ukuze umhlaba uzokulapha ngoba sisaconnect nomhlaba wena bhuti, sesihlale sigqoke iy'cathulo, sihlale sifaka amasokisi, abantu abasaconnect nomhlaba.
We find this little path that winds round and round and goes up on top of a koppie and then comes back into the forest. And we're thinking, like, what is this from? And I think what it must have been is an aloe display area in the old days. But the trees had grown up and over it, and there was too much shade, so the aloes had all died, and now it was just weeds. So together with some boys from St. John's College next door, we chopped and cleared, and we restored those pathways. A lot of the East Wilds had been mown and mown for years. I'm like, why are we mowing this? Let's just let the natural grasses grow through. And so together with City Parks, we've been doing that. And now the wild indigenous grasses are coming back. And that's what Joburg was all covered in the old days. So I think if we can restore even just pockets of high-fold grassland, it's very important. I've worked alongside City Parks all along. And what's happened at the Wilds now has become a bit of a blueprint. So it's the cooperation between community and city which makes these parks work. People call me an activist now, and I suppose I have become that, but it didn't start. I wasn't trying to be an activist. I was just trying to look after this nature reserve. So it just came naturally. It just one thing followed the next, and it grew and grew and grew.